Invite the light and send greetings to everyone. Warm welcome to everyone here in the loft. Got a nice crowd here in the loft here on Queen Street. Everybody out there in Zoom land, people there in Vision Trains, thank you so much for allowing me to broadcast through the non-stop 24/7 Vision Train, party, learning, art. And also welcome to everyone who's watching the recording of this. So welcome to this second session from the Empathy with Nature series that I've been doing. We're focusing on human nature and looking at it through the eyes of Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner. There's some people here tonight that have not heard of Rudolf Steiner, which is great because I love to talk about him and his work. And so to look at human nature, we're going to have to get a bit of a running start at it, going back in time to look at the origin of the human. But before we even get there, we're going to have to look at the origin of the earth, because the origin and destiny of the human is inextricably woven with that of the earth. And this brings me to one of the sources that I'm using for this talk, a book by someone still alive, Dankmar Both, still working out of the clairvoyant insights of Rudolf Steiner, called The Mutual Evolution of Earth and Humanity. So yeah, this is one of my sources. I've also been sourcing from other researchers such as Hermann Poppelbaum, Günter Wachsmuth, and Wolfgang Schad, if you want to look up any of those heavy hitter spiritual science dudes. Because the further we go back in time, the less information we have regarding the nature of things. There's less fossil evidence, and we often have to extrapolate from what little evidence there is, using logic and inference. Can lead to some conclusions. So can relying on, to some extent, the ideas of someone like Rudolf Steiner, who, as I explained in the previous session, was a highly evolved clairvoyant, known as an occultist. If you look him up on Wikipedia, he's an occultist from 100 years ago. And that was a common term used during that time. Didn't have any negative connotations back then, as it sometimes has these days when people use the word occult. But it simply means one who's researching the unseen aspects of life that are beyond the reach of the senses. And this is very helpful when the conventions of science come to their limitations. We can then benefit from information that is clairvoyantly rendered to access the occult history of things. And this is entirely possible not only because there are records in the Earth's layers or strata, fossil records, there is a record of the Earth's history also imprinted and preserved on other dimensions. One might even say the subtle or vibrational strata that are also part of the Earth, sometimes referred to as the Akashic record. Anyone who develops their powers and skills can access this information, somewhat the same way an archaeologist accesses things imprinted in the strata beneath the Earth's surface. Not really a stretch of logic or plausibility, if one thinks about it. It's all about getting beneath the surface to get a better look at things. So Rudolf Steiner, through the use of his powers, gives with quite extensive detail a rendering of prehistory, the early conditions of the Earth and solar system, and the evolution of the human and really all species. Because he is a scientist of the spirit, it's inclusive of the spiritual dimensions that inform life and are behind the manifest material realm. That was his specialty. Or as Jung might call it, to look at the interior aspects of the exterior, the interior aspects of the exterior. So in rendering this information, it was by no means Rudolf Steiner's intention to have people take his word for it. or to build another faith-based edifice of beliefs. As part of his work, he in fact gives indications on how anyone can develop their own powers and learn to do as he did. In fact, he said this development was in the destiny of the human being, to develop these higher powers, higher modes of perception beyond the five senses. And part of the process to get there is to listen to the descriptions of those who are already there, to take them in, contemplate them, consider them with logic and sensitivity, allowing the ideas to work upon you as a primer to developing your own such powers. And so this is what we're doing right here, right now, this evening, and in this 7-part series. We're taking a little journey into Steiner's body of work, his spiritual science, which he referred to as anthroposophy. Can everybody say anthroposophy? Anthroposophy. All right, not bad for a start. You're in the club. Which literally means the wisdom of the human being. To look at what the human being is, where we're coming from, and all within the context of the Earth's evolution, as this book title implies. We need to look at the human in the context of the Earth's evolution. And we need to be able to think. To think clearly and to think creatively. Or as I introduced in the first session, we need to become more proficient as thought artists. Thought artists, or I shorten that down to thartists. We need to be thartists. To bring a quote in from Rudolf Steiner, he said, "Since people today on the whole can no longer think properly, since people today on the whole can no longer think properly, they misunderstand what exists on Earth as plant, animal, and human. Thus, materialistic Darwinism arose." He's saying because people really don't have the capacity to think properly, clearly, even creatively and imaginatively, they misunderstand what exists on Earth, and then they succumb to a materialistic Darwinism. So this is the first part of a quote, which I'll finish when we get to the end. But I want to emphasize that in order to enter into a truer picture that includes the whole of reality and not simply default to a materialistic Darwinism, we're going to have to work at it. We're going to have to exercise our cognitive capacities and even our higher cognitive capacities in order to see correctly. Or as Jung puts it, unless we use both sides of our brain, we're not going to be able to see straight. So, in setting out on this journey into the past, we need from the very outset to determine which fork in the road we will take by asking an important fundamental question to determine the origin of everything. Is the Earth alive? Who believes the Earth is alive, a living organism? So put your thumbs up, and people out there in Zoom, if you want, you can put your hands up, or you can put your thumbs up with your little reaction to indicate that you think the Earth is alive, that's a living organism. Okay? Seeing lots of thumbs going up there. Now, put your thumb up if you're not sure or you don't think that the Earth is actually a living being organism. Okay, seems kind of quiet out there now. So yeah, it's great. Seems like the vast majority of people here are able to take this fork in the road, because this is a big mystery, perhaps the biggest mystery of science. How did life come to be on this planet? Next question. Is the universe, that which surrounds the earth, alive? Is the universe alive and intelligent? Again, put your hand up, your thumb up, if you think the universe is also alive and intelligent. Okay, we see some very enthusiastic yeses out there. Put your hand up if you're not sure that the universe is alive or you don't think that it is. Okay, there's some people out there honestly not sure if the universe itself is alive the way the earth might be. So this too is something that science struggles to quantify. According to its own standards of measurement, science is challenged, improving or disproving for that matter, whether the universe is alive and intelligent. Although this has become one of the most compelling questions in the scientific community, to understand if there is a cosmic intelligence. Is there a cosmic intelligence at work? Has there been some sort of creative intelligence in the formation of the things on Earth and the Earth itself and the solar system? Currently, the usual picture that science presents is that it is all lifeless, mechanical, and quantifiable processes. Physical and chemical processes colluding in the creation of everything. Since we have become better at quantifying the physical laws at work in the world and the cosmos, that so much can be presented with mathematical models. It has become a reductionist mechanical view, and that really has become the predominant belief and story we tell ourselves about the origins of life. A reductionist mechanical or mechanical, coined the term mechanical processes that are really the origins of life. Although still, no one can explain how something that is animate can emerge from something that is inanimate, mechanical, and just mathematical. Ironically, as the amount of data about the planets grows, so do the problems faced by astronomers in forming theories of the origin of the solar system. It's actually getting harder. But what is currently the best guess is the Kant-Laplace nebular hypothesis. The central idea is that the solar system began as a cloud of dust particles in space. And gravitational attractions of the particles caused them to start swirling and colliding, at which point chemical forces bonded them together. Eventually, the pressure became so intense that heat built up. This ignited our sun, which then sent out parts of itself as orbiting planets, which then cooled down and became what they are today, or somehow becoming habitable for human and other forms of life. This picture, no question, has some merit to it. But the urgent question to be asked is, was any of this an alive process? Or just dead, dry, mechanical processes? Was there any living creative intelligence behind this? Or just meaningless, random physical processes that just happened to come into the right combination to create what we have around us? Let's consider at this juncture that we take the fork in the road that says there is a living creative intelligence at work in the universe and can therefore produce living things, as opposed to the other fork in the road, which assumes that the universe is simply dead and mechanical, which leaves us with the problem as to how something without life can produce something with life. Things that are alive can produce things that are alive, right? Things that have no life cannot produce things that are alive. They cannot even produce things that are dead. Because if something is dead, that would imply that it was alive at one time. things that are lifeless and mechanical have never been proven to produce something that is alive. And this will become an interesting point when we consider in session 5 the transhumanist vision, where hope is pinned on the belief that humans will fully merge with machines one day and attain immortality this way. We'll look at that in session 5. There is indeed much to make us wonder in the content of this course here, but let us continue down the fork in the road that considers a starting point and an ending point, for that matter, that considers a living intelligence at work in the cosmos, okay? And as we work with the ideas regarding evolution from Rudolf Steiner and his anthroposophy, you know, I'll say anthroposophy? Anthroposophy. All right, getting better. In anthroposophy, it's not a belief system. It's really a practical practice. It's kind of a mindset that's about getting us to observe more closely what takes place in the natural realm. One could say a basic rule of thumb for understanding the principles at work in the larger universe is to observe what is mirrored in the processes taking place on Earth. That's really a good rule of thumb and approach, that somehow the cosmic principles and life and thoughts are mirrored in the natural realm on Earth. In other words, as I stated in the first session, if we want to get to know the mind of someone, we need to look at their fruits. What is hidden in the interior or occult aspects of the universe can be seen in the exterior or externalization of it in living forms. That's how we get to know the mind of the universe, through its fruits. For example, Rudolf Steiner says that what we have as a solar system is not the first version of the solar system. For those who are familiar with the Matrix, it was a shock to Neo when he learned from the architect there had been previous versions of the Matrix. In fact, 5 previous ones. In the case of our solar system, Steiner points out there have been 3 previous iterations of it, and we are currently living in the 4th. This is, of course, occult knowledge that can be accessed through a rendering of the Akashic record, the Earth's living memory. This isn't something that can be accessed through the normal conventions of science. But we don't necessarily have to go the route of occult knowledge if we observe nature and how things work on our planet, or what I like to call plan-plant planet, the plan-plant planet. The occult or interior aspects are exhibited by external nature. We just need to learn to read the book of nature in new ways, or as Goethe called it, nature's open secret. To observe nature's open secrets. We can see how the planet goes through cycles and seasons. Think of how a perennial plant or a tree goes through the cycles of the seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter. Each time it goes through a cycle, it grows a little further. A perennial plant will seem to implode each autumn, but will return again and again each spring. A tree will go through the cycle, blossoming forth in spring, flourishing in summer, fading in the fall, then having a rest and recess in the winter. Each spring, it recapitulates what took place in the previous cycle, then grows a little further, right? We can observe this in nature. And this might appear mechanical, and to some extent it may be, following a pattern. But this sort of thing could be a balance of mechanical and organical. mechanical and organical, life processes supported by mechanical timing and patterns so that life-filled form may emerge. But as was pointed out already, only something living can produce something alive. So there has to be an organical aspect even within the mechanical. And as an important side note for future reference as we go ahead, it only looks like the tree is dead in winter. But in fact, what has happened is that the activity has moved from the exterior to the interior. And so the main point here is that similar to what we see exhibited in the seasons and cycles of the earth and the plant kingdom, also takes place in the solar system. The earth mirrors in a microcosmic way what is inherent in the way of the solar system itself. In other words, the solar system goes through a spring, winter, summer, and fall. It goes through spring, winter, summer, and fall, each time returning like a perennial plant or a tree, recapitulating what took place the previous cycle and then taking it a bit further. There's very sound logic to this, and in fact confirms what astrophysicists have been more recently suggesting, that the development of all the elements or metallicity of the solar system from what was assumed to be the hydrogen and helium beginnings would need much more time than is currently considered possible with the current aging of the solar system at 4.5 billion years. In other words, some scientists are concluding that there must have been 2 or 3 iterations of the solar system before this one to allow for the metallicity and the development of all the elements that we have identified in the periodic table. So what Steiner said 100 years ago, as with many of the esoteric things he stated, are being borne out as true by recent scientific discoveries. And so in his rendering of prehistory, Rudolf Steiner names the previous iterations of the solar system by their esoteric names. He calls them ancient Saturn, ancient Sun, ancient Moon, as the 3 previous versions of our current solar system. And each one of them in more rudimentary forms than this current one. These names, ancient Saturn, ancient Sun, ancient Moon, will become clear as we take a brief look at what these earlier stages consisted of. But first, I want to share a diagram with you. It's a very simple diagram showing the stages that preceded us. The first one being ancient Saturn, went through its own spring, summer, fall, winter. So it bloomed into a certain level of beingness and then receded and went interior, goes exterior, goes interior. One great cycle. Within it, there was smaller cycles. Then the ancient Sun iteration of the solar system, the ancient Moon, and now the present Earth solar system as we have it. And there will be, yes, a future stage. So in contrast to the Kant-Laplace nebular hypothesis, the solar system didn't necessarily begin as a swirling cosmic dust cloud, but actually began with the essential and foundational element for any life to exist. Any guesses? Carbon would be the building blocks for form.
Light.
Getting warmer. How about warmth? Warmth. It all began with warmth. All life requires warmth. And we know from our experience on Earth, all processes begin with warmth, the warmth of an idea, for example. So you might imagine a living cosmic intelligence producing warmth in which to incubate the forthcoming life, and in fact to incarnate life into a manifest form. And so in the first stage of the Earth's development, there is warmth, not necessarily a physical warmth as we think of it, but a cosmic warmth of the cosmic intelligence, a more ethereal form of warmth, or you could even say warmth ether. And warmth itself can exert a gravitational pull. So what followed in the Earth's development moved from a more ethereal state to one that combined the gases and more densified material to what we have today, which now also includes a physical warmth from the physical sun, creating physical warmth due to the gases that are now there and the friction of solids caused by the radiations passing through the atmosphere. But in order for there to be life, there has to be warmth. And so at the very beginning and center of it all is life-bearing warmth. So this warmth beginning took place as the first iteration, the spring season, you could say, of the solar system, which in esoteric terminology is called the ancient Saturn stage. It was a giant ball or globe of warmth, even larger than our sun is now. The diameter extending to what is the orbit of Saturn now, although the planet Saturn did not exist at that time, but this is one of the reasons why it is referred to as the ancient Saturn stage. Its diameter was as big as the orbit of Saturn. It also explains why in some ancient mythologies, Saturn was referred to as the original sun. Very interesting thing that people puzzle over, why Saturn had been referred to as the original sun. Sometimes ancient mythologies often contain accurate esoteric knowledge about prehistory. One other thing to note about this first expression of the Earth and solar system in ancient Saturn, as it went through its life cycle of spring season, summer, fall, and winter, returning eventually to an interior state. During its blooming, you could say this great globe of warmth did a literal blooming, kind of the summer of its cycle. And Steiner says the great globe of warmth started to individuate into smaller globes, kind of appearing as mulberries globes within the larger foundational warmth of things. It was a fruition, not dissimilar to what we see as the fruition of plants on Earth at this time. And this makes all logical sense if you contemplate this image and think about it. So these individual globes moved in and out of form, forming, receding, blooming, and then fading in microcosmic cycles, just as the whole cosmos did on a macrocosmic scale from its warmth beginning until its ultimate receding back into a fully interiorized winter state. So these mulberry-like warmth globes actually laid down the foundations of what later became the physical realm and our physical bodies, talking way, way back in evolution to when things were warmth, and our physical bodies at the beginning were these warmth globes. So what we are saying is that our physical bodies began as blooms of warmth, the seminal expressions of cosmic intelligence, thus making the indiscernible discernible. What makes this picture challenging is that conventional science doesn't recognize warmth as an element of itself, but rather a product of other elements of gas, liquid, and solid. But warmth needs to be recognized as an element, as did the ancients, who in their own sciencing saw everything in an elemental state of either solid, liquid, gas, or warmth. Earth, water, wind, and fire. Then we can recognize how warmth was at the beginning on its own, rather than just the result of gases and masses colluding, as suggested in the Kant-Laplace nebula hypothesis. As a further side note, Steiner warns us when we describe things and try to put in words things like this, it will be somewhat inaccurate because our language is designed to describe things of today that are of a physicality. But we're trying to picture and understand things using concepts we carry about things based on our limited understanding of things today. So using language to describe these occult things is a bit like putting a square peg into a round hole. But we must try. We must try to put it in words, and then through the words to create pictures of these supersensible realities. The good news is that studying this sort of knowledge, these esoteric pictures passed to us by seers like Steiner, is an exercise to expand our consciousness, to embrace a greater picture of reality. And we will eventually be able to imagine these things on our own. This is all part of the balancing of our scientific side with our artistic eye. So at the end of the ancient Saturn cycle, everything was drawn back, interiorized, just as it does on Earth in winter, back into an interior state, as if dead and gone, like a maple tree looks in winter. But that is just an illusion. The activity has just swung inward in preparation for the next blooming outward, which then came in iteration number 2, known in esoteric terminology as the ancient sun stage. At this stage, the warmth of the first stage reappeared, but did the only thing that warmth can do, and that is begin to cool. This began the next step of the journey where things begin to cool, condense, and solidify. In this cosmic stage, gases began to be part of the cosmic warmth. Gas planets would eventually form out of this, taking a step forward, what we now have as warmth planets, gas planets, liquid planets, and solid planets. But it wasn't there yet. It was still fairly nebulous, not unlike how science imagines it. But the main difference is that spiritual science imagines a premise where there is something of a living intelligence behind all this. And that is what allowed things that are living to eventually emerge from all these elements in due time. And so it was at the ancient sun stage, the foundations of living beingness took a step forward. And we can imagine the great globe of warmth, now smaller than it was during the first ancient Saturn stage, moved towards a state that was now more akin to what we think of a gaseous state, which allowed for the beginning of emitting light. So there is your light. The light came in after the warmth. Then the following stage, the third stage, known in esoteric terminology as the ancient moon stage, brought the perennial blooming a step forward. First, again, with a recapitulation of the previous stages, just like a perennial plant does. And then a furtherance of the condensing and densification of the warmth gases into a more liquid state. The central warmth shrunk even further, getting closer to the size of our present sun, but not yet fully. Other planets began to emerge out of the blooming, including the eventual separation of the Earth and Moon from this sun warmth center. I say separated out from the sun because most everything originated out of this original nebulous warmth, including the Earth and Moon. And this all becomes very interesting as we listen to Steiner's descriptions of how this cosmic intelligence worked to bring things into a balanced configuration so life could evolve as it has with all the wondrous forms we see. But let us take a moment to turn to some artistic activity. I want to get out of the head a little bit. This is kind of heady. And to engage ourselves in another way than just listening and thinking, by doing some art that allows us to listen inwardly and also to bring the right brain more online. As a good Waldorf teacher, I was always looking to balance head, heart, and hands. So now you must be wondering what the next stage of evolution was, what it was about, which is our current stage, which is simply called the Earth stage. However, it is important to note that all the stages were really about the Earth. Even in the beginning, it was really the beginnings of the Earth's evolution and embodiment. It has been about the life of Earth from the beginning stage, and the insertion of other elements and the diversification of other planets into a solar system are really just about setting up an extended environment for the emergence of life on Earth. Now, that may sound a little Earth-centric, and it is. But in a way, as Steiner points out, the Earth is the center of the solar system. Perhaps not in terms of objective space, but as the center of incubating life. And we experience this subjectively. It's like how a child can become the center of attention in a family, but it is the parents that hold the space. They hold the center space along with the extended family, while the child has its place within the family. So it has, in a way, been about the Earth all along. And so you must be imagining, in the sequence of things, arriving at this fourth great cycle, the Earth stage of cosmic evolution, is where everything comes together, solid, despite the fact that, ironically, there has been also a spreading out of disparate planets in the solar system. Yes, it has been about coming into a solid state at this time on the Earth. But let us not imagine that it was this way from the beginning of the fourth stage. As mentioned earlier, every new cycle begins with a recapitulation of the previous stages, as demonstrated in the plant kingdom, in the revolution of seasons. Each new spring taking a perennial plant through the previous stages first, then going further in its growth. We see this recapitulation also in human embryonic development, which we'll get to when we get to human development. But before the Earth became as solid as it is, it repeated the other three iterations of ancient Saturn, ancient Sun, and ancient Moon. So in the earlier stages, Earth was less earthy, you could say. And at one point, the Earth's mass was more like a warm soup. Steiner says that at that stage of the recapitulation, the Earth, Sun, and Moon were still all joined. The Earth, Sun, and Moon were interpenetrated as one body. And one must realize that the Sun was not as hot as it is today. At that time, the life of Earth was being incubated by cosmic warmth that only later became more of a physical warmth after the separation of the Earth and the Sun. And it may also help to realize that the acknowledgement of livingness isn't necessarily limited to biological life. livingness isn't necessarily limited to biological life. This is a very important point when we get to the session that questions what exists after life. A consideration all our ancient ancestors took very seriously. What lives on after the end of biological life? That will come in session 6. Right now, we're looking at the Earth and how it was at one time in the sun, and the moon was in the Earth, which is not far off from modern science, except at that time, things were more the consistency of thick soup, warm, thick soup, with these planets interpenetrating each other and on a much larger scale than today because they've hardened and shrunk. Another thing contrary to conventional science is that the sun is a consumer, that it not only radiates out, but it draws in. Scientists have puzzled over the sun and when it will burn itself out. But the thing is that the sun draws in, breathes in from the surrounding cosmic space, consuming fuel from the outside as it radiates back out into space. And this understanding of the sun being a consumer is something being pioneered by scientists in the electric universe movement, which is turning a lot of so-called settled science on its head. And these scientists are really confirming what Rudolf Steiner said 100 years ago. The sun is consuming from the cosmic field around it to feed and fuel itself. This is not just mechanical. It's an expression of living cosmic intelligence, meaning that the sun is actually alive. The sun is actually alive. Otherwise, how could the sun be the source of all life on Earth if it itself is not alive? So at that time, when the sun and Earth were unseparated as one cosmic orb, the Earth inside the sun in turn was passing cosmic nutrition to the Earth. Steiner paints a picture of how there was something of an embryonic activity of the Earth within the sun. The sun, of course, not the way it is today, not producing heat as it does now from a distance from the Earth, but rather the sun at that time was something of a womb with cosmic warmth, holding the Earth within it, feeding and nurturing the Earth as it drew nourishment from the surrounding cosmic space. But what comes next is where this whole story gets even more awesome and wondrous. Compliments of Rudolf Steiner's insights to stimulate our thoughts and thoughtistry. As the Earth's substance condensed and grew thicker, it was like a great living amorphous slime. At one point, the Earth was like a ball of slime, and out of the slime, from the ongoing feeding and fertilizing powers of the sun, living beings began to individuate in the slime. Clumps of living slime emerged. Slime beings, of which Steiner says today's oysters are reminiscent. But there's one great distinction. These ancient slime creatures were gigantic in size. Gigantic, slimy oysters upon the Earth, emerging from the living, slimy consistency of the living Earth. Steiner compares these gigantic oysters to the size of France. He was in Germany and he said the oysters were as big as France. Oyster-like creatures the size of a country. A little hard to wrap your mind around. We have to constantly remind ourselves the environment was much, much different back then and therefore capable of producing such creatures. Creatures, of course, that would not be found in the fossil record because at that time, the Earth had this soupy, warm consistency. But it's not hard to imagine that such huge creatures existed in the Earth at one time. The Earth and Sun were both larger and had not condensed to today's size. We know that there have been other giant creatures produced by the Earth in later stages. There's the dinosaurs, there's the megatherium, the great beasts with the giant sloths and mammoths, giant bears, saber-toothed tigers, the giant sea cows, etc. Things have shrunk in size over time. Why? Well, one reason is because things were on a gradual trajectory of densifying and condensing since the original ancient Saturn period. The separation, when the sun separated from the Earth, it began to radiate from a distance. And one of the effects of this is drying and condensing. That the sun radiating from a distance has this drying and condensing effect. And this is why these giant oysters, these giant slime creatures, started to evolve a hard shell. The shell formed on the top side of these giant slime creatures, leaving the bottom exposed to the slime of the Earth, where it could directly leave slime trails that fertilized the Earth, and thus more slime creatures were rapidly born. The formation of this protective shell on top because of the radiating sun outside of the Earth, Steiner likens to a dog having a wound that it licks and then exposes to the sun to form a protective scab. This is exactly how these shells started out, scab-like on the surface, then getting harder. In order to protect itself from the effects of the sun, the slime creatures evolved this shell on top, which Steiner says was like horn plate, or even somewhat like the texture of a turtle shell. There is still today a creature reminiscent of this, with just a shell on top, but a slimy underside exposed. Anyone know what it is?
Jellyfish.
Not a jellyfish. Jellyfish don't have a shell on top.
Snail?
Snails have one continuous shell that encloses them all around. Oyster has a shell on top and bottom. Anyone heard of an abalone? Abalone? Okay. Abalone. I have a picture to show you. Abalone. You have probably held one because this is what people use for their smudge bowls.
Oh, that's the one with the color inside.
It's colored.
The nice
It-
effervescent.
It's the top side of the abalone, which has an exposed bottom side that can connect to the Earth through its slime being. And this is similar to what these giant slime oyster-like creatures were back in early stages of Earth's development, when it was recapitulating the warmth, gas, liquid stages, and were fertilized by the sun when the sun and the Earth were interpenetrated. But then when the sun was separated from the Earth and radiating its warmth, the sun can actually cause things to die. There's a death force in the sun as well as a life force. So the slime creatures developed this shell on top and was able to receive the sun forces reflected up from underneath as the Earth does when it stores sun forces in itself and then radiates back out. But the time of the great abalone oysters floating in the soupy sea of the Earth came to an end. And what we have left of these giant oysters is the land masses, the continents we live on. They are the fossils of these creatures that now float in our salty oceans. So, yeah, the Earth is not made up of dead, lifeless rock, but really the fossilization of living creatures that grew out of the living Earth in a distant past. Yeah, we come to this astonishing realization that geology and biology were not so distinct back then as we see it today. Geology came out of the biology of the living Earth and living creatures. As we start to wind this down, I want to give you a little bit of a slideshow, some more pictures, and I want to introduce Giuseppe Joe, who is a spiritual scientist artist, and he is a research partner of mine who has helped me in this research. He is an accomplished artist who's now turning his hand to illustrate ideas from the research we're doing. And he's here in the Zoom room with us. So as we look through a few of his pieces of work, he is going to chime in. All right, Giuseppe Joe, you in there in the room?
Hello, Jesse. Yeah, I can take from this point on.
Thank you.
All right. Well, as Jesse has mentioned, according to Rudolf Steiner, there used to be giant animals at the size of a country's landmass, also giant Earths. In this illustration on the left side of this kind of shielded slimy creature, they would be swimming in an Earth-Moon unity. So the moon would be still in the Earth, and the total mass of the Earth would be much bigger than today's Earth. So it can afford the inhabitation of those rather giant inhabitants. But anyhow, on the left side, where labeled the physical sensory, you can see that an adult form or mature form would have a kind of shell on its back, and it's swimming in a kind of soup substance, according to Steiner, about consistency of milk, but very thick milk, condensed milk. But besides it, there are those newborn ones that does not have the shell yet. Yeah, like these are very, let's just say, simple and primitive animals that they're not really identifiable senses or limbs or anything. It's just that they move, but their structures are also extremely simple. But just gives you an idea of what kind of animal are we describing. We're not describing, birds, dogs, cats, that kind of animal. We're describing an extremely simple, primitive life form. It has life. It's just very simple.
Slime.
Yes. Can you go to the next slide? The interesting thing is there are lots of ancient mythological pictures actually mirroring Steiner's description, and the most notable would be the Hindu myth called the Churning of the Milk Sea, and this is written in the Mahabharata, one of the very classic Indian Vedic texts. Anyways, in the story, there's a struggle between the heavenly Devic forces and the Azuric forces, and they were having this kind of struggle of power, but it's the location that's interesting, because according to the myth, Lord Vishnu turned into an avatar of a giant turtle at the central pole of the world in an ocean of milk. So, I mean, we have a sea that's consistency of milk, and we have a giant turtle, which is a shelled creature. So like they really fits Steiner's description of a giant shelled creature that's the size of a country, and also Steiner pointed out that the landmass of the Earth's moon used to be polarized, meaning on one pole it's all the continents, all the land masses. The other pole it's basically all ocean and where moon existed. So like they really match quite perfectly with each other. And on top of that, the Native American Indian myth of the Turtle Island from a couple of North American tribes, at least that I know of, also refer to at least the North American continent as a giant turtle, or at least on the back of a giant turtle. So again, we see this theme of a shelled creature that's giant, that's the size of either a country or continent. And they're from completely different like parts of the world, but they are all ancient people's either memory or clairvoyant seeings, and they kind of match records with a modern clairvoyant as Rudolf Steiner. That's something to think of. Anyhow, so this picture gives you a kind of more accurate rendition of the so-called abalone oyster. By the way, this is a little bit later rendition from the previous one, so maybe you'll find they're a little bit different. But anyhow, what I want to point out is, like Jesse said in the beginning, our imagination of very ancient things can be a little bit off because we're applied today's physics and everything. And the same with the name oyster or abalone, they're just approximate descriptions. According to Rudolf Steiner, there are about 6 overlapping traits of this ancient being, or rather we can say there are 6 let's say kinds of things that are inheriting traits from this ancient being. So they do resemble sperm in many ways because they have, according to Steiner, they have actually a long tail. That's very different from shellfish today. Shellfish today don't have a tail, but Steiner said they have tail, very long ones. Of course, they do resemble oyster in terms of they're kind of slimy, they're soft. And like snail and earthworms, they leave a trail of slime when they're moving. And there is a modern equivalent almost of this ancient being called Vorticella. So Vorticella is a very, very small animal. It's microscopic. You have to see it through a microscope, but it really shares the same kind of slimy body and a very long tail. And most importantly, it can reproduce asexually. It doesn't have to lay eggs. It can split itself into new offsprings. Finally, the back of these oyster abalone-like creatures would resemble a wound scab, which is not an animal, but you know it's like a part of an animal's surface. Anyway, let's move on a little bit. As Jesse mentioned, there was a time when Earth and Sun and the Moon used to be one celestial body. And within this celestial body, the so-called oyster, abalone, or slime creatures already existed, but they did not have any shell because there was no sun outside of it to kind of baking the top. The sun's property was also a little bit different, but we'll talk about that very soon. Anyhow, after the sun has separated from the Earth-Moon unity, when it's outside, then we have this image of similar to an abalone. As you can see, there is a horn-like shell on top, but its belly, its bottom side, is completely soft. And that side will be swimming in this soupish Earth-Moon unity. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, so as Jesse have mentioned, the formation of the so-called oyster shells, they are not. We have to be aware they're not calcifying. They're not hard calcified shells we burn our incenses, because the crystallized mineral did not exist at that time. Rather, it was more like, our wound scabs are more like condensed blood and the liquids coming out of the skin, things like that. It's not completely crystallized. It's more like that kind of substance. Even that is a little bit far, because today we have minerals in our body fluids. But that's as close as we can imagine. I gave the sequence of, first there is a shellless, like newborn body, completely slimy and kind of does look like a sperm. And then the sun, which is now outside, starts baking the top of it. Well, just like a pancake, it starts to get brown and hardened. And then on the third stage, it hardened to its maximum and start to look and feel like an armor. But be sure to know that it's not crystallized rock. Okay. Yeah, so when the sun and earth and the moon was one unity, we have to be aware that they are not solid spherical shapes, but rather the substance, let's just say, of sun, moon, and earth was one kind of giant bubble of cloudish sort of thing. And as mentioned before, those giant oyster-like creatures actually already existed at that time, but without any shell. And within this sun, moon, earth unity, they reproduce at a rapid rate because the sun force and the moon forces, which one has to do with fertilization and the other has to do with conception, they can freely meet each other. So really any substance around those creatures can be just directly formed into their own image without they have to go through the process of have to lay an egg and then the egg start developing, anything like that. According to Steiner, like in like one instance, they can reproduce millions of their own offsprings. So that's a very, very fast like reproduction rate, which also laid the foundation of life. We gotta have so much life in the beginning in order to have other life forms that comes after. Like Jesse said, you have to have something living in order to have something else that's living. Okay.
Something else just to point out here briefly, you've drawn this as an oval because apparently the sphere of the sun, the moon, and the earth together was not round at that point, and the rotation was a lot slower. So it wasn't perfectly round. It had more of this oval shape in space, and that's why you've drawn it that way.
Yeah, that's another point. It's very weird. The Earth or Sun or Moon, apparently when they were one body, they used to be an oval. That's according to the research of Gunther Wachschmuth, which is a secretary and a very close follower of Rudolf Steiner. Yeah, so Jesse mentioned that before, that when the sun and earth and the moon were one body, as shown on the left, the sun, he said the sun was not extremely hot, but the sun, earth, moon unity was made of like pure life force. So everything is life, everything is alive, but not this burning hot globe that we experience today. However, he said after the sun has separated from the earth and moon, it starts to pulsating or sending out the life forces through an environment. And because there are frictions and interactions, it starts to radiate the kind of burning heat that we are more familiar of today. nevertheless, even with this radiant heat, when it arrives at Earth, it still managed to bring life. So if it still brings life to Earth, then at its origin, at its core, at its center, or before it become hot, it must be full of life. So this is the slide showing how geology and biology weren't really separated in this ancient state when the moon that's still in Earth. This egg-shaped Earth-Moon unity, you can see the moon is on the right side of the screen. That's still in the Earth, whereas those brownish side of things, they are actually the living surface, let's just say, of the Earth, which are able to reproduce those oyster-like creatures. On the top, I showed 3 stages. So first, you got this, let's say, soupish, liquidy sort of substance of the Earth. But then, because the moon forces was still in Earth, when the sun contacts the surface, those oyster-like creatures can directly emerge out of the surface of the Earth without laying eggs or anything. And then, of course, finally, the sun has baked their surface so that there is a hardened shell.
Baked oyster. Mm.
Tasty.
Mm-hmm. Oyster's information. Okay.
So the last stage would be the continents. Well, you can see in the center of this illustration, there are those oyster-like creatures at their different stages. But some of them have this hardened shell piling together, and that would be, let's just say, the proto-continents. They're not the real continents that we're standing on because they haven't crystallized, they haven't hardened. They would still be kind of muddy, liquidy, but nevertheless, this would be the beginning of a land mass. So essentially, the land masses, they weren't rocks to begin with, according to Rudolf Steiner and his followers. They were living creatures, shedding their hardened body parts, and because yeah, and then later, after the moon has separated from the Earth, they start to fossilize, and like Jesse said, the continents are actually fossilized animals. This would be the final slide, and from left all the way to the right, I am showing, according to Steiner's followers, at least, the Earth used to be one, let's just say, ovalish globe with all the continents consist of those oyster-like creatures, but more like a skin really wrapping around it. And at that time, there was no separation between, let's just say, the watery ocean and the land, because everything is slimy soup. Everything is mixed together. But I labeled all the continents, and you can say that the very beginning of the continents were familiar of already started taking their general shapes and the positions. So we got Africa, and besides Asia, Europe, and so on and on. So then, as things progress from left to right, because the sun keeps baking, let's just say, those living creatures, and then we start to condense everything. Just like you bake anything on a frying pan, the size is likely to be smaller than getting bigger, right? So things get smaller, so the continents also start to kind of shrink and it gets smaller. But on the other hand, the more liquidy parts of them start to squeeze out of them, let's just say. I think a good example would be, for example, if I'm frying a bell pepper, then the bell pepper itself will shrink significantly, but all its water, you can say, will come out of it and be around it. So that's how the proto-ocean was formed. So eventually, let's just say, those continents used to wrap around the entire Earth. They got shrunk to about the third size of the Earth, and the rest would be the future ocean. But there was no liquid water we know of today yet. However, the continents did, become much more, let's say, closer to solid of today. And afterwards, this giant piece of arched continent becomes solidified, and it was agreed upon by material science that there used to be one giant continent instead of the 7 continents. But eventually, because of magma or things like that underneath, they start to split into separate pieces. So from that point on, pretty much spiritual science and material science, they do agree. There used to be one giant continent, and they start splitting. And I think that's it for tonight.
Thank you, Giuseppe. That's so wondrous and awesome. It makes me think about how, when people do land acknowledgements and they acknowledge the indigenous people that have lived on the land in these areas, we should also now include gratitude to these giant oyster abalone slime creatures that were the first formations of the continents that we walk upon. Absolutely amazing, this picture moving from life to life rather than this mystery of how did life emerge out of dead matter. So what we're doing here really is finishing Darwin's half-finished theory of evolution, as I referred to it in the first session, using imagination and pictures and thoughtistry inspired by the seership of Rudolf Steiner. And this is really requiring us to step up and to not look at things in a mechanical reductionist way. But as Goethe said, if we want to behold nature in a living way, we must follow her example and make ourselves as living and flexible as nature herself. So I hope you'll take this picture presented tonight and to live with it and let it live within you, the sense of the livingness of the origins of the solar system and our planet. And to close, I want to complete the quote that I opened with. I'll do that, and then I'm going to finish off giving the human assignment for the week. And then we've got a great group of people here. I think we're going to make some music tonight. I saw somebody come in with a Shruti box. So looking to have fun with that. We'll do that afterwards for anybody who wants to hang out and listen to music, do art, meditate. But yeah, the quote that I began at the beginning from Rudolf Steiner, where he said, "Since people today on the whole can no longer think properly, they misunderstand what exists on Earth as plant, animal, and human." And this is what we've been saying here. People are not picturing things correctly. Their ability to conceptualize is compromised because we don't have the correct information, or we don't have the right approach to the information, which in a lot of cases is perhaps too materialistic. So to complete this quote from Steiner, he said, "Thus materialistic Darwinism arose, which believed that the animals were there first, and that the human simply developed out of the animals. It is true that in the external form, the human is related to the animals, but the human existed earlier. and the animals really developed later, after the world had gone through a transformation. And so we can say that the animals we see now present a later stage of an earlier condition when they were more closely related to the human. But we must never allow ourselves to imagine that out of the present animals, a human being could arise. That is a thoroughly false idea. And with that, I leave you on a cliffhanger, which will be concluded in the next session. And now the human home play assignment for the week. First one is, how were you raised? What ideas were you put into your mind about the solar system? Or what have you observed on YouTube? There's so many YouTube videos about how the solar system came to be. Do you have a sense of it being something alive or something lifeless and mechanical? Was it what you were taught, was it done dogmatically? And did it jive with your own thoughts? How have your thoughts evolved over time about the origins of the solar system? The second one is really the art exercise we did tonight with paper and pencil crayons. Move the hand in gestures that emulate a sense of warmth. It doesn't matter what it looks like, just focus on the feeling of warmth. Let it fill the page or even spill over the page. Feel the expansiveness of warmth, nebulous, but definite at the same time. Do this a few times and then see what wants to emerge out of the nebulousness. Draw in more definition and see what appears. Let your imagination go to work. Analyze it later if you must, and enjoy. The third one is, of course, Michael, what is it?
Ruck show.
Show. I always give the ruck show every time. Surprise. Take a few minutes each day to review the events of your day in reverse order. View yourself from an objective, higher perspective, going through your day backwards. What do you see? What are you shown? What do you learn about yourself? This is a way to strengthen many things, including mental picturing, memory, empathy, and self-knowledge. There's your human home play assignment. Thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of this. Thank you so much for receiving the research that Giuseppe and myself have been doing. I hope this inspires your thoughtistry and your perception of where you're coming from and even where you might be going.